Hello and welcome to the Sabrina River Folk Podcast with me, Nicola Haasz. My guest tonight is Dr Mike Jenkins, the author of the book The History of Place Names in England and Worcestershire, published in 2021. Mike is a retired GP and joins me to talk about his discoveries through his research and writing the book. So, welcome to the podcast, Mike.
Thank you very much indeed, Nick. Thank you for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be here.
You're very welcome. So we're both amateur historians with a passion for our local history, and I was researching in the Worcester Museum one day, and I saw your book, and I picked it up and I bought it and I read it and I really enjoyed it. And it's one of those books that I'll keep going back to because there's so much information in it, Mike. But before we take a deeper dive into the book, I wonder if you could just tell us a bit about your history and your connection to the River Severn. And you're a Worcestershire man, I believe?
Well, actually, I'm a South Walian, and I was born and bred on the Bristol Channel coast of South Wales. And so I probably did get quite intimate with the Severn fairly early on because the waters of the Severn would have passed down our shores. But the first time I really came across the River Severn was as an actual barrier to our annual family trip up to the London Motor Show in Earl's Court. And we were suddenly set upon with this incredibly wide river, which we had to cross on the Aust car ferry. And this was long before the construction of the bridge in 1966. So that was my first experience of the really large, vast River Severn compared to myself as a child. That is true. But in the decades we've been in Worcestershire, about 40 years now, my family and I have walked the Severn, and we've explored the Severn on kayaks, on rowing boats and motorboats. So we've been pretty intimate over the years. It's been a great companion and great fun, great resource.
Amazing. And I love that word companion. And it's not the first time someone has described the river in that way. Yeah, that's lovely. So you're a retired GP, Mike, involved in lots of education and research, had papers published in the British Medical Journal, etc., through your career. So how did your journey lead you to writing a book about place names?
Yes, that's a very good question. So yes, I had a wonderful career. I was very lucky, and many positions in Worcestershire in medicine led me around the county to visit practices all over the county. And you couldn't help but notice these kind of odd, comical, sometimes alien names like Upton Snodbury and the Vigo, Kimberonga Lane, the Riv, and Wire Piddle. I mean, it was just absolutely amazing. Who coined them? How old are they? Are they actually meaningful? What are they calling out? And it came to pass that I realized they were highly descriptive and highly meaningful. But what was really interesting to me is that they were so highly descriptive, they told you about the folks of the past. Because many of the forms that place names take seem to me to be in the image and the spirit of their creators. And it was getting into those people via place names that really interested me.
Yeah, that really comes through in the book. As you say, the voices of the past.
What was really interesting, what I got more interested in as my studies progressed, was the ancient names, the names that really are glimpses of very, very ancient people and their relationship with the landscape and the reasons why they named those names exactly as they did, related to their daily activities.
Yeah, you say in your book that river names are probably some of the oldest words we have. Can you explain why that is?
Yes, well, it really does reflect humans' relationship with the landscape, because before the first farmers in the Neolithic, and we're talking about now 4,000 to 6,000 years ago, before that time, the Mesolithic and the Paleolithic people were basically hunters and gatherers. So they moved through the land. They moved across the land hunting, and we know that they also engaged in long trading journeys. So all those things help you realize that they had to navigate the landscape. And this navigation of the landscape seems to have been passed down in oral history, in songs and chants, to pass down this vital survival information, if you like, through the generations. And so they were using rivers and mountains and other topographical features of the landscape as directional markers. And of course, on top of that, the rivers are extremely important for sustenance and for supporting daily living, for religious beliefs, and indeed as transport. When you think that in Northern Europe and Britain, about 90% of the land were trees, it was a very useful way of transport. The other way into one of the reasons why we think that river names are some of the oldest is there are these things called core words in many languages, and they're to do with the words you use every day, like mother and father and sister, son, grass, nose, heart, all these types of things. And you'll find that some words relating to water are found in those core words, the longest surviving words in the family of languages called the Indo-European languages. And these are to do with water and river and to flow alongside other words, core words for daily living. So this is one of the reasons why I think that river names were in use long before human settlement names, and that's why settlements adjacent to rivers are invariably named after the river rather than vice versa.
You draw particular attention to the obviously the names in Worcestershire, and I like the way that you really vividly explain what the landscape would have looked like through all of the different historic periods. And as you're reading, you're imagining yourself, on the Malvern Hills, as you say, which are astonishing. But they would have been as equally as astonishing to our ancestors. And they would have revered them as much as we do now, and certainly used them as a point of navigation. But you go into the book about what it would have looked like when you were standing there in the Mesolithic or the Neolithic, and then into the Iron Age. And it's very evocative of those things. And it must have been such a joy to imagine those people and what their type of communication was like, what their language was like, and obviously we have some examples of words in Worcestershire that you believe go all the way back to the Iron Age. What were some of your favorite words place names that you discovered?
Yes, I think the my favorite was the most obvious, and that was when the Celts migrated into the area we now call Worcestershire, and the archaeological evidence suggests about 600 years BC, around that time. And we know that these some of the tribes, certainly the Dubini tribe, which there are 7 references in the Roman literature about, they spoke a common Brythonic Celtic language, and it's called Common Brythonic just because it later in the centuries AD it diverged into Cumbric Celt, into Welsh Celt, into Cornish Celt, and into Breton Celt. So we know some of these words because they were put into the Roman literature and later into the Anglo-Saxon literature. So when these Celts first came into this area, you need to remember that there was far more forestation than there is now. So in Worcestershire, as in most of southern Britain, now we have about 13% of coverage, whereas when the Celts moved in, there was around about 50% of forest coverage. So they would have looked up to the Morven Hills and they called them Moel Fryn. Fryn is one of the words they use for hill, and Moel is bare. It's still a word used in Welsh mountains, in the related language of Welsh at this time. There's quite a few moels in Wales. So this Moel Fryn, it reflects, of course, that the hills were bald of vegetation, but it also takes you into the kind of mental topography of those people. It was that impressed them. It was that they valued, as well, of course, as the River Severn.
And I think the British, we love a good place name, don't we, Mike? It's just part of our kind of collective culture. We love a silly or a rude place name or something like that. And I do wonder if our ancestors made up some of these words just to amuse us in future generations. I'm not sure.
Well, I think you're absolutely right in that we know the Old English had a sense of humor. In their language, you have a slang which is crannock, and crannock is a person who has legs like a crane, very long legs. And we have lots of hills around Worcestershire and southern England called Callow. And Callow was a bald vegetation in the Old English language rather than moil in the Celtic language. But it also applied to men who were bald. They called them callows. And they were very, very big on nicknames too. And they would use those types of nicknames for people. And we're talking now about the early medieval period, from about 450 AD to, the 10th, 11th century.
Amazing. Yeah, I mean, the depth that you go into in the book is incredible, where you talk about how place names really unlock some of the history of those places. Even I loved the chapter where you talked about reintroduction programs of wild creatures that have been happening in this country. Research was done around where to release some of the species based on the local names of places. So, for example, if you have a local village name that had the word beaver in or otter in, this might be a great location for a reintroduction of species in that area. And that just blew my mind. That was incredible.
Sure. Yes, and it's happening right here, right now. So you've got a local tributary of the Severn called the Otterburn, and of course it meant the stream of the otter. And now, over the last few decades, there are otters in Worcestershire, of course, and they're really enjoying themselves and really proliferating. Just upriver from Worcester, you have Beverly Island. And Beverly Island was significant in the past because when there were Viking raids, and there very often were Viking raids in the 9th century in around the area we now call Worcestershire, and the local population took refuge in this Beverly Island. But the name Beverly is from Beorfor, the Old English for beaver. So we know that there were beavers around there at that time in the round about the 6th and 7th century. There's only 22 place names in southern England after the beaver. So we know that it was getting quite rare at that time, as opposed to about 400 names exist related to the crane. and that included an old name they used to give Evesham, which was Crannochom, which means the bend in the river where the cranes live.
And that's another takeaway for me, was how some of these old words were really descriptive in the topography of where they were describing, like you say, the bend in the river where the cranes live, or the part of the river with the reeds. And, it really captures the imagination, and how creative they were with their language was really lovely. And it was really nice when I was in Worcester, I think about 2 years ago. I was still on the Sabrina Bridge, and I saw otters in the water, which was absolutely wonderful, down there by the rowing club. So that was a really special moment.
Yes, yes. Just recently, over the last few months, they've reintroduced the beaver back into the Severn at Wyre Forest.
Right, yeah.
Yes, yes. And Wyre Forest, like so many topographical names in southern Britain, is a Celtic name, and it means winding. So it's it relates to where the forest is, which is winding to reflect the winds of the river.
Yeah, because the Wyre Forest is part of where the Severn flows through south of Shropshire, is that right? And
Yes,
down,
it does.
yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
yes,
between
yes.
Kidderminster and yeah, Telford,
That's
yeah,
right.
yeah.
Yes, and not far from there we have the Upper and Lower Arley, and Arley is derived from the Old English Ern, which means eagle, and the Lee part is just a woodlands clearing. So the woodlands clearing of the eagle, almost certainly the white-tailed fish eagle, which hasn't been reintroduced yet to Worcestershire, but has to the Isle of Wight and to the Western Isles, and they are magnificent birds, and the name reflects that they plied their way up and down the River Severn in around the 6th and 7th, 8th century.
That's incredible. It must have been so bustling with wildlife then. Let's hope we get back
Yeah.
to that again one day.
Yes, yes.
So through writing the book, what did you discover about the origins and antiquity of river names in general? Because you go into quite a lot of detail that a lot of our words are sort of European words. They borrow from lots of other different countries in Europe, particularly Northern Europe. So, were there any sort of general trends that you found when you were researching this?
Yes, yes, indeed, Nick. The amazing thing is how I discovered that things were so much related. Things which you don't think are related, indeed, on closer examining, they certainly are. They have common origins. So we know that a lot of the river names, there's about, 70% of river names in southern Britain are Celtic in origin. Certainly in England at the moment, around about 70%. And these names go back, thousands of years. Most of them are Celtic, but some may be actually pre-Celtic, before the Celts. You were talking about the Bronze Age and maybe even the Neolithic. So we have a tributary of the Severn in Worcestershire called the Teme. And that shares the same root and meaning as the Thames and the Tees and the Tame, all these rivers that we know in Britain, but also the rivers of Europe, such as the Temengo in Portugal and the Tamaran in France and the Tamaro in Italy. They're all actually related. And they're even related, and this was, I've found quite hard to believe, but they're even related to a tributary of the Ganges called the Tamas. And that's because it's reflected in the writings of the Sanskrit language about 4,000 years ago. And all those place names, all those river names are related to one another in the great Indo-European language, and they all mean the dark one. So I just found that incredible, that things can be related through language and through a tremendous geological span, and geography of what 7,000 miles perhaps between Northern Europe and the Indian subcontinent.
And what did you find on the origins of the Severn? Because we know that the oldest word for the Severn that we have documentation for is the word Sabrina, which is the Roman word that was given to the Severn when they arrived here. But can you explain more about the actual word?
Yes, I'll certainly try. You're quite right. Sabrina appears in the record in around about 115 AD. But we know from written history, we know it's a female Romano-Celtic name, and that's what the Romans were very good at. They didn't make up their own names all the time, or very, very rarely. They Latinized the names given by the indigenous population. So we know that the Romans came to the area we now call Worcestershire around about 48 AD. So they may have named, and there may have been documentations and records of it being called Sabrina then, but they didn't survive. And it was the Dubini who were the Celtic tribe at that time. We think that, and they spoke a common Brythonic Celtic language, as I've previously explained. There are some experts who think there was an earlier origin, and there almost certainly was, which was not Latinized and was purely Celtic, and that is said to be the Samarocina. But I don't know in detail. That means the land of the summertime fallow. But I don't know the exact reasons why they say that, the actual evidence. Later on, we know in Anglo-Saxon times, the river is recorded as the Severn, and that was in 759, and that means seafarer. So each culture with their own language has a different kind of slant on a place name. And then later in 800 AD, in Old Welsh, it was called Habren, and in 1150, it was called Hevren, which may be related to the Celtic word haf, which is again to do with summer. The later names are Suern in the Domesday Book and Suern in 1205, and it's not until 1836 it's actually recorded as the River Severn. So in Celtic mythology, the Severn and the Wye were believed to be sister rivers from the same mountain father called Plinlimmon. And Plinlimmon comes from Pin Limon, which means the 5 peaks. So again, it's very, very similar. It's a cognate, as they say, with the Scottish Gaelic Celtic names of Lomond Hills and Ben Lomond. They all mean 5 peaks. So that's how far you can go back. But in what's really interesting and you find this time and time again, that you very often don't find that a name is unique. It's often found in other places too. So we know that there were river names in Bedford, and they're called former river names because they're now no longer used, in Bedfordshire and in Ireland, called the Sabran. But they're no longer used. They're called by more Anglo-Saxon names. We also think, as an expert community, I've discovered that the common origin of the Severn, the Sabran, is also reflected in the modern French river names of the Sever and the Sevres. So, and that's quite common, as I say. They're duplicated because they're basically Celtic names, and it's reflecting the distribution of those peoples who spoke Celtic language in the past, which was pretty widespread over Europe. What really didn't surprise me, that I came across a 1896 reference of a sunken panel in a rock over a Roman bridge in the headwaters of the Euphrates. and in the Middle East, which recorded in Latin that it was built in the time of the Emperor Decius, that's the reign 249 to 251 AD, over a river called Sabrina.
Wow.
And again, that's a Latinized name of a previous Celtic word. Of course, the Celts no longer live there. As migrations come from the east, the names change, and the river is now called the Cara Budak.
And what does that translate to? Do you know what that means?
It must mean something, but I haven't looked into that yet. I only fairly recently discovered that it was the Cara Butak. But you can bet that one of those names may well mean river, and the other may well mean a description of that river. But we also know of attested settlement and river names in places as far away as Scotland to the Iberian Peninsula, and from France to Turkey, which are Latinized Celtic names. So again, it reflects the wide distribution of the Celts over the last, something like 3,000 years over Europe. It's worth also mentioning that in the Pictic language and in the Gaelic language, there is a word used for the generic word river, and it's called the Abran. So Abran, it's cognate with the modern Welsh Avon, all of which mean river. So I don't know. There could be a connection between the use of the Celtic use of the word river as a generic, Abran to Sabran.
And do you think that the name Sabrina could have been bestowed on the river because it was such a special river?
So in what way would the River Severn, what we call the Severn now, be special? And yes, I mean, it is a special river. It's the longest river, and it was a tidal river. So in the past, before the 19th century public works, it was a tidal river right above Bewdley. And that included the Avon and partly the Team too. So it would have been a vast floodplain at one stage to really mammothly larger than the estuary around Slimbridge with far more birds and waders and fauna and flora. So yeah, I think it is a special river. I think there's a possibility too that it's such a long river. Like quite a few rivers, it may have had different names called by different people in living in different sections of the river. That is a possibility. A very common way of naming a river in Celtic times, and probably in pre-Celtic times, is they often use the generic name in that language that the material that was in front of them, so to speak, and they call the river that name. And there are lots of examples. Obviously, Avon, meaning river, but also there was a common Brythonic Celtic name called Dwfr, and Dwfr is cognate with modern Welsh dŵr, and basically it just means water. So there is a river going through Dover in Kent it was called the Dwfr. And when the Anglo-Saxon scribes saw it, they called it the Doffer, Doffer. And then when the Normans came, they had a V in their language, and the Celts and the Anglo-Saxons didn't. It was mutated to Dover, Dover. But the meaning of that settlement name now is it comes from the river, and it actually means in the Celtic language just water. And I think that Tolkien knew this, because in many of his books he illustrates his maps by saying the river or the water. It's not actually given another description. And one of the reasons we think that is that if you're farming in Celtic times below a a hill, then it is the most important hill around. So people tended to call it the hill, Ibrin, rather than any other description, because there may be only one hill around. And I think that's quite common today. If you ask, I asked a chap in Evesham a few years ago, what's this? And he said, oh, that's the river. He didn't say the River Avon. He said that's the river, meaning his river, our river.
In terms of, and you touch on this in the book, the deification of rivers, the rivers being turned into, and I think you said it was during perhaps the Iron Age period where we'd become settled in our lands, we'd started to farm the land, we'd already been building burial chambers and made stone circles, and we were really beginning to have ownership of the landscape and feel connected to it. And I agree. During that Iron Age period, we start to see deification in the sort of Iron Age period of rivers and other things. But there does seem to be a particular focus on these water places. And
Yes, yes.
do you see any evidence of this in the place names of rivers and their connection to a particular goddess?
Yes, that we do, and we know the Celts, like many populations before them, held animistic beliefs and revered the natural world, and they believed that there was just supernatural spirits inhabited all things in nature, and they could be interacted with and influenced with. That's the really important point, I think, and they were particularly close with waters in their various forms. They venerated them as a life-giving force. They named them, even in Worcestershire, you see this, the Celtic names are evident even in the smallest streams and springs. They thought them important. And of course, they gave valuable personal possessions, offerings to rivers and lakes. They had a nasty habit of putting their enemies' heads in some of their springs, which I'm not sure what public health would think of that now. Not a great idea, but they certainly revered the water courses, and certainly generally the Celtic myths describe divine rivers, and then the rivers' names, particularly in Ireland. But archaeological evidence has shown in Gaul and in modern France and in Britain, they demonstrate that major rivers were certainly worshipped because of the worship points along those rivers. And this is certainly true of the Seine and the Loire in France, and the Thames and the Wharfe here, and many others. River names which have a root diva, such as the Dee and the Devon, rivers Dee and Devon in Ireland, are, and many more on the continent actually, all signify divine spring.
Yeah, and I think that going back to what we were saying about different areas having different names and different personifications of the river, is there any particular names that crop up in Worcestershire that relates to Sabrina or the Severn in any particular? I know there's modern day places like the Sabrina Bridge and places like that, but are there any older names of settlements near the river, for example?
Yes, indeed they are. And they really are ace names, because they give a deep insight into what our relatives were doing at the time, their daily activities beside the river. So in Worcestershire, we have quite a number of place names with the word load in them. So there's Saxon Load and Cleveland Load and Hampton Load, and they all mean slightly different things. But the load part comes from, it has the same derivation as the lodestar, meaning a navigation aid. So this is in the context of a navigation point across the river. So it refers to a ferry or a ford there. And it advertises the fact this place name has a ferry or a ford or a way of navigating the river. Of course, there's such a large number. There's Draycott near Kempsey, and this is downstream from Worcestershire, and it derives from the Old English drag dragu cot, meaning the cottage by the portage. And as I mentioned, before the public works of the 19th century, the Severn was extremely tidal. So there were times when you couldn't actually navigate it. So these were places where you had you had a section where you would do portage over land of the craft. So that shows you one activity that they had to do. There is a place near Tewkesbury called Twyford, and that's self-explanatory. There are quite a number of Twyfords in southern England, and that's because it was between the River Severn and the River Avon, and there were two fords, one ford crossing, so it was a very convenient place to have a settlement. There's a Danesford, which is just outside Worcestershire, but creeping into Shropshire, and that's a hamlet on the river just south of Bridge North. And it was called because a Danish army overwintered there just for one winter in 896 in an unsuccessful attempt to take Bridge North. But the incursion was never forgotten, and the name stuck, even though they were only there for one winter. They almost all died because they were besieged and had to go back to the east of England. And there is a lovely name called the Riv. And you can imagine with the pronunciation, this is a word of Celtic origin, but I think it's fairly recent. It's probably was corrupted by the Welsh drovers, because rid means ford in the Celtic, in modern Welsh too. And so it was a place where you could ford the river. But I think they mistook, because they mistook the original Old English name, because that was called Gerid, which just means cleared land. But they hang on to the rid part of Gerid and thought it should belong to the ford crossing. And it certainly is. You can see, oh gosh, those large Douglas firs there, which the drovers very often used as directional markers. And there is a Riv Green there, which rather suggests that there was grazing there before they went they took their cattle and livestock over the river. So that's a really fascinating one. We've got Kempsey, which I mentioned before, which is south of Worcester, and that you can tell immediately it's in a low-lying part of the land, because the EI of Kempsey means island, and not island as in the sea, but island in relation to firmer ground surrounded by marshy ground. So there's quite a lot of EYs, Badsea and Ibney place names in Worcestershire. And there is Severnstoke on the river. And this is interesting because the Normans had great difficulties with the Old English place names, because they were all very much the same. There were lots of stocks, Old English STOC, which just meant a settlement. But the Normans, of course, had to tax people, identify them and tax them. So they would add a name to suggest exactly where it is. So Severnstoke is on the River Severn, and they also added a lot of Norman hierarchy names, lords' names, or names of the church. Like there'd be a Stoke Prescott, because that was the surname of the hierarchical Norman family name, or there'd be a Stoke Prior, because it was owned by the church, but it had the stamp of ownership because in Norman times. There was one particularly amazing place on the river, which is extremely beautiful. It's in Worcestershire, and when the Normans came, it was called Gurberhalle, and the Normans really disliked some of the Old English harshness. They thought it quite crude and vulgar, so they came across Nottingham and called it Nottingham, because it was so difficult to say. But this place was rechristened Bewdley, which is Bow Lee, meaning in Old French, Norman Old French, beautiful place. And it is indeed a very beautiful place.
It is. Beauty is lovely. It's just so in depth what you can learn from a word.
Yes, yes. I rather think it's like relearning what you thought you know,
Mm,
because we all know the names of places around us, but we may not know their meaning. And you look at them again when you understand the meaning. We have a hill around here called Puck Hill, and that is related to the a very important Midlands hobgoblin. He was one of the top hobgoblins, Puck. And of course, Shakespeare knew that Puck, Oberon's hobgoblin, and there was a book written by Rudyard Kipling called Pook, wasn't it? Pook Hill, and there is a Pook Hill just above Bateman's in Sussex, where Rudyard Kipling lived, and so it's all connected. It's just amazing how things are connected.
And I think that's another thing from the book is that you really encourage people to be a place name detective.
Mm-hmm.
And before I read your book, I'd never even heard of the English Place Name Society, founded in 1923
Yes.
at Nottingham University. And I didn't realize there was actually a society that studies
Mm.
place names. So that was really interesting. And
Yes.
yeah, I think people should really take an interest in the place names where they live, and it can unlock so much history of the area. It's just absolutely fascinating.
Yes.
And I think you're right when you say that we in modernity can have a continuation of this when we're naming new settlements and new roads and things. We're still using that idea of connecting the name of that place to its history. And I see, I've seen that quite a lot. Yeah.
Yes, yes, absolutely correct, and I salute people doing it. These developers, they do think about it, and there's a development near Aberley, and it's a an anglicised name of Glyndŵr, because Glyndŵr led an army, and there was a standoff, wasn't there, of a few days, and Glyndŵr's army, that's the furthest east they got, but is commemorated by a Glyndŵr way. And there was a modern housing estate in Worcestershire, which is called Weogora, and that's a nod to one of the first Anglo-Saxon tribes in the area, the Weogoran, and it means the people of the winding river. And that's really interesting in itself, because even though it was an Anglo-Saxon tribe, it's got a Celtic name. And like the Anglo-Saxon tribe that moved into Worcestershire from the south in the end of the 6th century were called the Huici tribe, and you recognize them with Wychhaven, Wychbold, Wychbury Hill, all reflect the tribe. But the actual derivation of the tribe is thought to be of Celtic origin. And that's interesting, because in the first few generations in southern Britain, the Anglo-Saxon royalty often called their princes and princesses after Celtic names. So there is evidence of a lot of cooperation and intermarriage and respect for the Celts at that time, as well as their warring and their battles, etc.
Yeah, I think in some cases there were blendings of cultures and blendings of timelines and obviously there was a lot of battles as well. But Yeah, so obviously it gives rise to lots of different names from different periods through history,
Mm,
and
mm,
it's so rich, our culture, and
mm,
the languages and the place names are just a small part of it, but unlocks so much. It's just
mm,
incredible. It really is.
mm.
Yeah, I mean, it's lovely chatting to you, and it's lovely to always for me to chat to people that are really passionate about the River Severn as well, and yeah, and just what's your next project? What are you working on next?
Well, I'm hoping that there won't be another lockdown. So I'm hoping that there may not be any. We're grandparents, and we're pretty committed to charities. And I think that was a unique thing. It was a unique opportunity. It was a unique moment in time where I had the time and the resources to look into something quite deeply. And I don't think I'll get the chance again, but I don't mind that. I think that means that keeps it a unique thing.
And you said that you're giving talks, you go out and talk to local history societies. So the
Mm,
work really continues all the time, and
yes,
there's always new things to learn, isn't there?
absolutely. I think I'm on my 21st talk, and you get so many interesting questions and requiring some kind of answer. So I'll go off and look it up. It's a never-ending road, but it's a fun road. And I think that it does go back to that you use the word revere and respect your ancestors because they are why we're here. And I think we owe them a lot. And I found that they're still calling out across the landscape um, these wonderful words which describe who they were.
Yeah, and in terms of the history of the earth, the history of humanity is just a blink of an eye, really, isn't it? And so we can almost touch history, we can almost feel it. And these
Mm,
fabulous place names are one way, as you say, to access that history. It's just such a great gateway. So thank you so much for writing the
mm.
book. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and it's one of those I think that will stay in my thoughts. Moving forward. So yeah, and thank you very much for joining the podcast, Mike.
Thank you very much indeed, Nick, for inviting me, and I'm so pleased that you enjoyed the book.
Many thanks to Dr. Mike Jenkins for joining me on the podcast. You can find his book, The History of Place Names in England and Worcestershire, The Voices of the Past, published by Yo Caxton History, online, or catch him at one of his talks in Worcestershire.